Hello, everyone. My name is Andrea. I'm part of the Collective Practices team, along with Olga, Daniela, Chinwe, Inga, and many others. Collective Practices has been an 8-month program of exploring and experiencing how we can get better at practicing collectivity over many different projects and collaborations. And this conversation that is about to start is part of the closing program of this edition. I'm saying, of Collective Practices funded by Hauptstadt Kulturfonds, that we see not as an ending, but as a connection point to ongoing and further practices of collectivity, not only by us as a team, but by all of us collectively. So therefore, we have named this series of conversations under the term "to be continued." And today, on day 2, we look into concepts of care, solidarity, and collective organizing. And we have started the day with a workshop on pirate care, practices of solidarity and care that are neglected, actively discouraged, or illegalized in the neoliberal environment that we live in. And this session that has just ended has focused on struggles and organization of migrant workers, in particular migrant farm workers and live-in care workers. And I might bring some points from that. There's quite an interesting conversation maybe into this. Let's see if we have time. So in this session, we aim to particularly look into the relations and practices of solidarity. What does solidarity actually mean? We'd like to unpack what actually are the practices and principles of solidarity. How can we understand it as a form of relation between each other? And how also can this understanding help us to organize and create solidary structures, to support each other in solidary ways, and to join forces in collective struggles based on solidary relations? We will start with a presentation on the theory of solidarity and then discuss the points raised from a more practical perspective of solidarity work, with a focus on housing issues that bring people together in a shared vision of affordable housing for everyone. And I would like to introduce the participants now. So if we can have a view that everybody is visible, who is going to participate? Is this already there? I can only see the backstage view of it. Okay, now, great. So the participants are Jeremy Gilbert, maybe, let me see, everybody who I'm saying hi to can make sure that, like wave or something, yeah, so that we know who everybody is. Jeremy Gilbert is a professor of cultural and political theory at the University of East London, where he has been based for many years, and recently taught a course as a visiting professor at Brown University, Rhode Island, on solidarity. And I think this, what we're going to hear, is also informed by those deliberations in this course. And then we have Adelaide and Laura. Can you also... Hello. Adelaide and Laura are among the founding members of the Right to the City working group of the campaign Deutsche Wohnen und Co. enteignen, a referendum and political initiative seeking to expropriate and socialize housing belonging to big property owners in Berlin. And then we have Matt Thompson. Can you also, yeah, hi. Matt Thompson is a fellow for public policy, practice and place at the University of Liverpool, who has recently published a book on housing co-ops and community land trust movements, and works on new municipalism and on infrastructure and institutional design for solidarity building in the context of housing and local economies. And thank you, Matt, for joining at the very last minute this conversation. For those of you following the conversation online, you can put questions into the chat or the Telegram group that runs alongside this. if you want to continue talking after the session, I recommend you join the Telegram group, because this one stays on while the chat on YouTube just ends after this conversation. And you can put your questions and comments anytime, also during the presentations, and we can pick them up later from there. So we will start, as I said, with a presentation on the theory of solidarity by Jeremy Gilbert. Jeremy, I don't know if you want to say a few words to kick this off.
Well, I recorded this last night, and I'm not used to recording this sort of short video. I'm a podcaster. I'm not a YouTuber, so I don't know if it's going to make any sense now. But I think I think it's as self-contained as it can be. So if it doesn't make any sense, then we'll try to unpack it afterwards, I guess. And also, just thanks very much for organising the session. Thanks to everybody for being here. It's an honour, and it's a great event.
Okay, then
Well, thanks very much for inviting me
to look at the presentation together.
And it's a really great, timely event. And what I'm going to be talking about is some ideas around the concept of solidarity that I first set out in just a blog post a couple of years ago, and which I've developed a little bit since, based on a course I taught at Brown University on the idea of solidarity early in 2020. The course sort of got cut short because I had to come home back to London because of the pandemic. And I've been thinking about these ideas quite a lot. They seem very relevant to all kinds of contemporary questions, and certainly to questions of collective practice for me. But mostly, I think that blog post I wrote a couple of years ago still sort of shapes the way I think about it, and is still the sort of skeleton on which I'm hanging any new thoughts. And I think it will end up becoming the sort of basis for the book on this topic when I eventually get around to writing it. So I'm just recording this video, and I'm just screen sharing actually the blog post, and I'm going to use the sort of subheadings of it as the sort of stepping stones of my little talk here. So, I mean, why talk about solidarity at all? Well, I mean, solidarity is obviously an important question, an important idea today. It's important in the epoch of neoliberalism. I would say solidarity, relations of solidarity and ideas of solidarity was the thing which powerful institutions, corporations, media agencies, governments were trying to destroy in every possible sense. I mean, the basic premise of neoliberalism is that there can be no real relations of solidarity between people, and if there can be, there shouldn't be, because they're dangerous, because they produce suboptimal outcomes. At the same time, in the era of COVID, obviously the question of solidarity takes on a whole new kind of life and death meaning, the question of what it means. And also, what does it mean to practice solidarity? What does it mean to be living in a historical moment when the best way to practice solidarity with our neighbours, with our friends, is not to go near them, is not to interact with them. And yet, in order to do that, we have to interact through the mediation of institutions like Zoom calls, and through the mediation of the state. And we require that a state be the institution which pools all of our agency and which is able to care for and look after people in ways that as individuals or even as small groups a lot of the time we can't, although the activity of small groups and the practice of mutual aid also remain really important to saving lives and keeping lives tolerable. So obviously solidarity, practices of solidarity, the experience of solidarity are really important issues and questions. But I think an interesting question, though, is at a certain level of abstraction. Well, what is solidarity? Like, what do we mean by it? Because it's a word that people on the left certainly all use. It's the word that across the society we use. I should apologise at this stage for the fact that I don't really speak very good German, and the people who've organised this event are based in Berlin. So in terms of the actual linguistic history of the term and the concept of solidarity, I can only really speak to the English and French contexts. Certainly in that context, the notion of solidarity. The term solidarity has its roots mainly in French terminology, and it always has something to do with some notion of shared interests, some notion that when people are engaged in relations of solidarity, when they're expressing relations of solidarity, what they're expressing is their shared interest in a particular venture, an endeavor, an outcome. Now, this is interesting and it's important because I would say the concept of interests is one which has really been marginal to most political philosophy, political theory, radical political thinking since sometime in the 1980s, when it got largely displaced and sort of pushed aside by notions like identity or recognition as being the key things which are supposed to motivate people's political behavior and political judgments. I mean, today in mainstream political science in the UK, for example, the dominant explanations of what has motivated a large cohort of aging, once working class, but now quite affluent property owners to support the clearly economically destructive project of Brexit has to do, most of the dominant explanations for that revolve around their supposed attachment to particular notions of white British identity as against any notion that they might be engaged in the expression of their material interests. But of course, that view has been challenged by radical commentators who have pointed out that all of the people who are, all of these, generation of 60-something reactionaries, who many of whom once supported the Labour Party, are also in the position, the historically unique position of being asset holders with, quite comfortable pensions and large amounts, and they're mostly people who not only own their own homes but have paid off their mortgages, and that their identification with some kind of residual reactionary version of British imperial ideology is clearly to some extent related to the fact that their interests are now allied to those of finance capital. So I'm only making all those points to show the ways in which the idea that you can understand political behavior in terms of interest or in terms of identities is a very prevalent idea in lots of contemporary thinking. And my claim would be that solidarity is always to some extent about the expression of interests, but it's about the expression of interests and shared interests in ways which can problematize identity categories in many cases, but can also give rise to the production of new ones. So solidarity, I think this is the first thing to say about the idea of solidarity. Then relations of solidarity are always expressions of shared interests, and they're always to some extent about what is shared, what is common. They're about what Deleuze and Guattari call the molar. They're about political relations operating at the level at which some form of collective agency becomes potentially stabilized. But that's not to say that they're necessarily about unity or identity or homogeneity. And I think this is an important concept to kind of think through to some extent, that I would say that they are not necessarily that relations to solidarity can often be very productive in the ways, or start the sentence again. The experience of difference and relations of difference can often be very productive in animating relations of solidarity. So, for example, my favorite historical example, whenever I think about, well, what do I actually mean by solidarity? What is solidarity? What does it look like in practice? My favorite historic example, and again, I apologize, it's quite a parochial British example, is this very important labour dispute that takes place in the UK in the second half of the 1970s, the Grundwick Dispute. Grundwick is a photo processing plant in London, and most of the workers there are women from South Asia, from Bangladesh mainly. And this is also happening in the context of a rise of far-right activism in Britain in the 1970s, a rise of anti-immigration discourse of the kind which will eventually carry Thatcher to power in 1979. And one reason it's still remembered as such an important historical event, and the reason why it was absolutely terrifying to the political right and to the sort of ruling class in the mid-1970s was because, starting off as this local dispute of poor, not very well organised Bangladeshi women, it escalated into a dispute which involved this active support from broad sections of the organised working class in Britain, including people, including the miners, including transport workers, etc., much more highly paid, much more highly ranked, if you like, sections of the industrial working class, and trade unions, which were completely dominated by white men, got involved in supporting the struggle. And this was seen by them and their leaders as a necessary counter to the rise of far-right ideas, but it was also seen as a real expression of a form of political class-based solidarity, which was actively resistant to racism and indeed to sexism and misogyny. These people were being influenced by anti-racism and the struggle against the far right, but they were also being influenced by women's liberation, which was beginning to make significant inroads into the trade union movement by the mid to late 70s in the UK. And in these cases, what you have is the kind of development of a form of radical political consciousness, which recognizes shared interests amongst all of these different groups of people and wants to express them. Now, I think this notion of shared interest, which I keep coming back to, is important, partly because it's a way of thinking about the politics of solidarity and the nature of solidarity, which I think is quite different from another way of thinking about it, which is quite prevalent, certainly in the Anglo-American left. So a great example of this would be just about this time last year, January 2020, I think it would have been, maybe February 2020, I think January, Bernie Sanders in the United States gave a great, fantastic speech in which he called on the people listening to this speech to commit themselves to being willing to act politically in the interests of other people, other members of the same movement, just as they would act in their own interest. And this very clearly evokes the classic Christian ethical injunction to love your neighbour as yourself, or ideally more than yourself. Now, one way of understanding what's being called for here is a kind of exorbitant ethicality, is that what's being called for is a kind of exorbitant ethicality, a kind of ethical behavior which is indifferent to self-interest, which goes beyond self-interest, which wants to care for, to care about, to help and protect and extend the interest of the weaker, the less important, etc., irrespective of one's own personal interest or the interest of one's particular social group. And I think there's interesting and valuable elements to that way of understanding what solidarity means, but I think it's basically a wrong way of thinking about it. It's not a helpful way of thinking. That it's much more important, it's much more helpful to understand that in fact what is going on when people commit themselves to a political movement or a collective practice or a struggle of some kind, is they are expressing a sense that ultimately they share interests with those people. So these guys on the picket line in London in the 1970s, these guys, these white, male trade unionists, they're not there just to be sort of white saviors to these women. They're not there just to be protectors of the weak. They are there because they recognize that these women's struggle is their struggle, that they have a common enemy, and that ultimately they will, by advancing their cause together, they will advance all of their interests, even if in the short term they advance the interest of these women more than their own. And I think this is fundamental to any kind of progressive and sort of democratic politics today, is I think this way of understanding relations of solidarity as always about the expression of shared interests. Now, that doesn't mean that solidarity is necessarily about unity and identity. I think this is a really important point, that there's certainly a strong tendency historically on the political left for people to hanker after some ideal of political homogeneity. People have a shared ideology, a shared belief, a unitary way of thinking about the world. And there's clearly within contemporary forms of politics, various kinds, anti-racist politics, feminist politics, etc. There clearly is a tendency, or there are certain tendencies, again, for people to want to pursue a politics which is fundamentally about the assertion of, the expression of a coherent, a unitary identity, which defines itself in very particular terms, and which wants to free itself from any contamination by, other identities, other other sets of claims which might be made in the name of other identities. I mean, what I would call a sort of neoliberal identity politics, which does not at all mean all or even most forms of anti-racism or feminism or any other kind of politics, but the specifically neoliberal form of identity politics takes the form of people wanting, on the basis of a particular identity, to be able to make particular sets of claims on the state or the wider community, but to make those claims as individuals, really, rather than as members of groups. And there certainly are, I would say, some sort of theorists, some thinkers of identity politics who want to who really implicitly, at least I think, defend a position which is hostile to any idea of solidarity, because it's hostile to any idea that people with quite different social identities might make common cause with each other to express their common interest, or that they might even have common interests. So, for example, there are certainly forms of feminism which understand feminism to be a sort of zero-sum game, a sort of zero-sum struggle between women for their autonomy and men who want to oppress them. My position would be, well, that might be a useful analytical framework in some instances, but in other instances it's very important to recognise that men ought to support feminist struggles, not only because it's ethically the right thing to do, not only because they should, check their privilege or, however you want to formulate some notion of deferring to people who've suffered more than they have. It should also be because it is actually in men's interests to promote feminist politics, because ultimately the overcoming of conventional established patriarchal relations of hierarchy will enable all human beings to express all of their multiple potentialities in more ways than maintaining those relations would allow. So I think this is an important and useful formulation. I should make clear as well here that I don't see that formulation as in any way a contradiction to, the most theoretically influential. All right, just be a minute. The most theoretically influential forms of thinking about the politics of identity. I mean, one of my inspirations in developing this line of thought is a line from Judith Butler in her book, her 94 book, Bodies That Matter, when she says, identity is the lived scene of coalition's difficulty. Meaning that coalition, that the production of political coalitions between different groups of people is always difficult, but it's always necessary, and it will always. And every experience of identity is actually an experience of, how that necessary coalition building is difficult. But that's not to say at all that it's impossible. And I think the mistake that a lot of people make interpreting people like Butler in a sort of neoliberal direction is to assume that because coalition building of that kind is often difficult, it is therefore impossible or even undesirable. And I think this is really important. And I think relations of solidarity are also always about a certain kind of process and experience of mutual becoming. They're always about a certain process of transformation, of potential transformation. What it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man, what it means to be a Bangladeshi worker, what it means to be a white worker, all of these things. What practices of solidarity will always express is the potential for these things to change, for these things to become something other than what they currently are, something better, something more than what they currently are. I think it's really important to understand, though, I'm also not saying that relations of solidarity are always necessarily class relations. I think that it's not necessarily, a very conventional Marxist explanation of what's going on at Grundwick in the 1970s, or what's going on in any kind of effective socialist politics today, would say that, well, the only relations that matter are class relations. The only matter, and so really what's going on is you're developing class consciousness, and that means realizing that issues like women's oppression or racism, etc., are all basically subordinate issues, which should be considered secondary or simply non-existent in the face of the priority that we should give to the production of class consciousness, universal class consciousness. That's not my view. That's a view that has some merit, but I would say that relations of solidarity, for example, relations of solidarity between men and women, between women and women, and between men and women in the attempt to challenge established, entrenched historic forms of patriarchy and their effects, can't be reduced to the expression of class relations, or the challenging of class relations. They might intersect with them in all kinds of complicated ways, but they can't simply be reduced to that. So solidarity is never just unity, and I think I'm going to stop sharing now because I realise I've sort of maybe I should have made it possible for people to read this on the screen if they want to, but I think if you want to read this, it's easy enough to find the blog post. It's just notes towards a theory of solidarity. Finally, a final point I would make about, or a claim I make there, is that in that little blog post in which I would continue to defend, is that relations of solidarity are to some extent, or in a Spinozan philosophical sense, are always joyful. In other words, they are always about the maximization of our capacities to relate to the world, to relate to others, of bodies to make productive connections with other bodies, whether the bodies are human bodies or machines or anything else. And they're joyful in this kind of technical sense, which to me is an important thing to think about, because for me, one of the most important questions for democratic politics and for radical culture and progressive culture is the question of how we produce what I call potent collectivities. This is a term I used in my book, Common Ground, which came out a few years ago. And for me, the fundamental question of democracy at the level of both culture and politics is the question of how do we make collectivities potent. Neoliberalism, to some extent, the whole liberal tradition, the whole of the capitalist tradition, wants to produce collectivities which are not potent, and which really doesn't believe that collectivities can be potent. In other words, I mean, the real kind of hardcore liberal tradition basically thinks that all agency and all rationality are individual. It can only be exercised really individually, or only should be exercised individually. So groups of people acting together in any meaningful way is either impossible or it's bad and it should be stopped. And the conservative tradition does tend to believe that you can have groups acting together, but it thinks the only groups that should act together are traditionally established groups with clearly defined hierarchies, like nations with sovereigns and elites at the top of them, or corporations like controlled by their executive directors. Whereas the radical tradition, I think, is defined really, the socialist, anarchist, radical tradition, radical democratic traditions believe that groups can be potent, they can be productive, they can act together, and they should act together. And then, in fact, agency and creativity are always the result of collective action, collective interactivity in the world. And one of the things which I think characterizes potent collectivities, whether it's just a group of people organizing a party, or people putting on an exhibition, or an entire political movement, or a political party, or a nation state doing good things, which they can do if they sometimes. What characterizes that always is certain relations of solidarity, between the people involved in the group. And what that always implies is a certain is a certain relation of equality, a certain relation of horizontality, if you like. And for example, to come back to the example of Grundwick, those workers, those white workers, don't see themselves as simply as sort of stooping down to protect and look after and save these women of color who they're working with. They're recognizing and expressing a relation of equality between them, a certain relation of horizontality, as opposed to a kind of vertical relation wherein they would maintain their position as privileged members of the working class, and they would continue to maintain the subordinate position of those women. And I think this, I think these relations of equality and as necessary parts of relations of solidarity are one of the things that characterize potent collectivities on any scale. Whether you're talking about as I said before, an artist collective, a nation state, or three friends on a WhatsApp group. To some extent, it was their relations they will be characterized by these relations of dynamic creativity, which I think can't really be separated from relations of solidarity. Okay, well, that's enough, and I'm sure there'll be a lot more to talk about in the session. Okay, thanks very much.
I'm here. Sorry. I'm here. So we can now go into the group view. The thing is that we were listening to this on YouTube, and I think the YouTube is a little bit delayed to the real time. So this way, have you all listened to this on YouTube in parallel? Okay, cool. Because I was kind of worried that you were missing out on it. Okay. So are we back on screen now? Okay, cool. Yeah, thanks for the presentation, Jeremy. And I think there are lots of points that we can take into the discussion. Before we jump into the discussion, I would like to invite Laura, Adelaide, and Matt to just very briefly introduce your background, where you're speaking from, so that we can understand also, like, when you're speaking about your practices and looking at the theory from the practical perspective, so that we understand where this is coming from. Maybe you want to start, Laura and Adelaide?
Sure. Thank you for your input, Jeremy, and thank you to Andrea and Akut for inviting us to this conversation around the political potentialities of solidarity-based practices today. As Andrea already said during the introduction of the session, Adelaide and I are part of the Right to the City working group inside the Deutsche Wohnen und Co. Enteignen campaign. It's a political initiative that is currently organizing a referendum in Berlin to expropriate big landlords, forcing the local state, if we win enough votes come September, to socialize over 240,000 estimated flats. DW, Deutsche Wohnen, the partial name giver of the campaign, is one of Germany's big corporate landlords. There are many others speculating with housing here in Berlin and in cities elsewhere across the world today. And they are credited to a large degree for driving up rental prices and housing prices, displacing our neighbors and friends, and changing the economic and social basis of what we call our homes. So inside DW & Co., the DW & Co. initiative, there's actually by now a whole array of working groups, steering committees, and locally based neighborhood teams, all headed by a main decision-making assembly. So if you're interested, have a look at the campaign's website, which Andrea also will supply on the website of Akut, and see where you can plug in. The Right to the City working group is a late and very recent addition to this political panoply. It's the first group working in English inside the campaign. In many ways, its founding imperative was both an act of solidarity and an effort to open the campaign to people that many of us felt were critically underrepresented inside the initiative. The creation of our working group aims at specifically joining forces with all Berliners who are legally barred from voting in the referendum. So everyone who doesn't have German citizenship and German papers. That's in fact over 20% of Berlin's population, who are often racialized and discriminated against on the housing market to extract extra profits, frequently facing the worst and highly precarious housing conditions. So we are organizing with people who have an innate and material interest that this referendum will be successful, and a substantial part of Berlin's housing market will be turned into a common that is accessible and justly and fairly distributing housing again. At least some parts of the housing stock of Berlin, a substantial part as we see it. As the first group working in English so far, it also aims to open a political space for people who would prefer to become involved and collaborate in English rather than German. So it is explicitly not a space just reserved for Berliners who do not have papers. That would be a misunderstanding of the Right to the City group. It's open to everyone who wants to organize around housing justice, expropriation, and socializing housing, and to do that in English, or wants to do that in English. English is certainly an imperfect start, but an important one, we believe, in an otherwise all German-speaking campaign structure that will hopefully support other working groups to evolve, working in additional languages. After all, as you can imagine, in Berlin, English is just one of many languages spoken. In fact, not even the most current or the most widespread spoken language. Shortly put, we want to scandalize in our work at the Right to the City AG what is at basis an unacceptable democratic deficit and injustice on the housing market, namely the exclusion of a substantial part of the city's people from the political process and say over our collectively produced wealth, and their discrimination and exploitation on the housing market. We also considered this working group as an essential part of achieving the campaign's core aims, which are not only to expropriate corporately owned housing and win this referendum, that's what we all obviously want, but to socialize a large part of Berlin's housing stock, a concept and political aim which stands in marked contrast to merely state-owned so-called public housing. It means to collectively own, manage, steer, administer that housing to make it truly in the hands of the public through the creation of tenant councils, various autonomous democratic structures, for example, distributing ownership and power across Berlin's inhabitants, tenants, workers, etc., as broadly and in the most participatory way as possible. For that to become a truly representative and accessible reality, social reality, that doesn't reproduce the same structural inequalities already existing, we need everyone, especially those who fare the worst, to become involved and help us forge that idea and practice of socializing housing in hopefully a joyful and fun way. So please join us and have a look at the campaign website. We want you and we need you. So that's it from Adelaide and me for now, and I'll pass on to Matt so he can give us an idea about his political work too.
Great, thanks, Laura. Well, thanks very much for inviting me, even if it was very last minute yesterday. But it's great to be here nonetheless, and yeah, I look forward to the discussion later. Let me just give you a little overview about what I do. So I'm a postdoc researcher at the University of Liverpool. I guess I'm looking at the solidarity economy, so thinking really through how we can sort of support the institutional structures that cultivate solidarity in practical ways as well as in theoretical terms. And right now I'm doing some work on new municipalism, this global movement that's emerged in the last 5 years, started by Barcelona, really, Barcelona en Comú, Barcelona in common, which is in my mind very much about stimulating a solidarity economy in cities through transforming political structures in the local state. But let me give you some background quickly about my PhD, which was about community land trusts and housing co-ops in Liverpool. I worked with various communities in the city during this period of my life, or probably around 5 years ago now, in creating solidarities really between residents who were otherwise atomized. And I guess we could just put the first slide up if that's. I've just got a couple of slides just to illustrate some of what I'm talking about. There we go. Yeah. So this is Granby in South Liverpool, where residents basically have pulled together in relation to solidarity in response to threat, really, to a threat to adverse conditions, to their lives being threatened by state-led displacement, where their homes are being knocked down and redeveloped, and they're being moved elsewhere, and in other aspects to capital speculation and incursions by capital. So interestingly here, the residents have, as Jeremy sort of alluded to, residents have come together through shared material interests in space. And this is very much about politics of space, these projects. And what I also did was a history of housing co-ops in Liverpool. So 3 decades earlier, before the community land trusts came about in the city, the city spawned around 50 housing co-ops, and these are much more traditional. And if you like, these are much more based on an identity based solidarity, slightly contradictory perhaps. So this is less about solidarity across difference and more about solidarity through a kind of homogenous cultural identity, and that was very much kind of Irish Catholic working class communities in the city. So interestingly, there are different institutional kind of ownership models that either help or hinder different kinds of solidarity making. And this is kind of the thing that I'm interested in teasing apart, really. So what the institutional structures can do for solidarity. Community land trusts, by contrast, are much more plural and open to difference, partly through the way that they are structured to a trust model, where they have a tripartite governance structure with different parts of the community represented. And so in Granby, in this place here, you can see in front of you, incredibly multiculturally diverse space where the Toxteth riots happened. So race riots, it's the centre of the oldest black community in the UK. In the 1981, massive violence broke out in response to police brutality and racist urban policy. And so the Community Land Trust today is very much the heir to that struggle, but it works across those differences of race, particularly race and class in the city of Liverpool. So I guess I can leave it there. I can talk a little bit more about municipalism later, but I guess the thing I want to emphasize here is that this is all about a politics of inhabitants and a politics of proximity. The thing that links municipalism with community land trusts at a local level, I think, is exactly that. So how solidarity basically can be cultivated through shared lives in a particular place, often sharing particular resources or sharing the governance of those resources. That stimulates a lot of mutual feeling, mutual understanding, and mutual aid practices. And I guess I'm intrigued to look into a little bit more how those things can be systematized, that moves beyond this idea of sporadic struggle, moments of political events that kind of rupture the mainstream with these kind of joyful collective endeavors. But how can we move past that to actually start to think about more long-term enduring forms of solidarity? So I'll leave it there. That last photo was actually home-baked, another community land trust across the other side of the city, which shares a great deal with Granby as a kind of tentative movement that's emerging in Liverpool. But I'll leave it there. Thanks very much.
Thank you to all of you for your presentations and for giving us a bit of a background where you're coming from. So we can start for the discussion. We can have the group view again, I think. Thank you. So that I can see all of you. So, how do we start? Well, I summarized a few points from your presentation, Jeremy, that I want to lay out, and then I feel that we can use as a kind of structural skeleton to go through a few points. But then I also want to, ask you if what your spontaneous reactions were to the presentation. But let me first give those like key points that I kind of distilled while listening and wrote down while listening to the presentation, which is one, like solidarity connects people in a shared interest. I feel like this shared interest is something that we can discuss about. Then the difference, the shared interest while being different. So people who have otherwise different backgrounds or identities share this interest. And I think this is something I'm also very curious to discuss. Then you talked about the horizontal relations among each other. So not kind of hierarchical ideas that are maybe more found on the political right, nor kind of moral motivations of kind of altruistically helping the disadvantaged, which also have some kind of a hierarchy, but really like thinking horizontally, which I find interesting to discuss. And then I think you all mentioned kind of the joyful, this is, everybody said this, and potent collectivities, and what this, like, maybe this is something we can end on. Those would be my distillation points of your presentation in short. I don't know if you if you had any kind of spontaneous reactions to the presentations, or something where you say, this is another point that we really want to discuss. This is something that is missing, that we find very important when we talk about solidarity. An open question.
Well, I think the question of how you build enduring relations is really interesting. Like how, I think it's a really important question of how, because that's the thing. I mean, it's the challenge which really faces sort of progressive politics, like certainly all over the kind of overdeveloped world right now, has been the long-term decline of the institutions that used to provide a framework for solidaristic relations, which is primarily the trade union.
Yeah, and thank you for bringing this in at the end, Matt. I think this is a very important point. How about you, Laura, Adelaide? Matt, do you have anything that you feel like directly, this is also something we need to discuss, or we want to discuss?
I mean, just to extend that point about how to sort of create enduring relations. The more I look into this stuff, the more I sort of speak to activists who are involved in these kind of campaigns and get involved with them a little bit myself as well. There's just this really deep concern to be able to get past reinventing the wheel every single time. There's a real disconnection between these kind of campaigns quite often. And yet at the same time, as soon as there's a realization that as soon as people start building kind of structures, institutional structures or bureaucracies effectively that could create those links over time, for education, for knowledge, but also for sharing these kind of things, then that also works counterproductively, right? It kind of seems to start to undermine some of the original principles of solidarity that were about spontaneity and about creativity and about the collective jouissance, if you like, of the joy of the moment of struggle. And I think that contradiction is really quite, it's very stubborn to get over, and it's hard to work out how to get through that. But I think that's the thing that really strikes me. How to move past this idea of reactivity to threats or to political problems or social problems. That's where a lot of solidarity building seems to come from. It's in the face of threat or hostility or adverse conditions. So how can we start to think about this more proactively, and how do we build solidarity through proactive, not necessarily struggle, but proactive kind of connections and movement building? I guess they're quite abstract questions, but.
Mm-hmm. Cool, thank you. Adelaide, you wanted to also say something?
Yeah, hi everyone. I wanted to say something, but now I'm not sure if we should answer Patricia Prieto. But
we take the questions from the audience later.
Okay.
This is just a comment from the audience. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to try to address the discussion from my perspective. I don't come from like university or academic background. Just I can only speak from experience, and I've been an activist since forever in Brazil, and then when I moved to Germany, and this experience have shown me being active in my homeland and being active abroad, that it's a twofold thing, and actually there shouldn't be any contradiction between solidarity and identity, but there is. And the only groups or contexts in which I've been active that solidarity was more or less a fluid exercise were actually groups where the existence of identity as an oppression tool was acknowledged. And this is what I wanted to maybe try to bring the approach to the discussion today, is that ideally it shouldn't be a contradiction between those two, but there is. But oppression based on identity exists, and the right to the city again is also a little bit of trying to, through the shared interest, which is housing, address the really concrete problems of being an immigrant tenant, if you ever get to be a tenant in the city. Not that I find identity or identity politics a super cool or even helpful category, depending on the context, but it's there, it exists, and yeah, sometimes it's really a pain in the ass.
Thank you, Adelaide, for this. Maybe this gives a good kind of segue into looking at one of the points that I also put as my kind of first question, which goes into this part of being different and organizing across difference. And I actually when I listened to that presentation yesterday evening as well, I looked up a quote again that came up in my head that was from that I want to put here to you, and then we can discuss. A quote that I had heard recently when I watched by Audre Lorde from the documentary about her Berlin years that were from 1984 to 92. Where she talked about in the context of feminism, about Black and white feminists, and we need to know and respect our differences. Then we can work together. We share the same earth. We need each other, but we are different. These differences must be used creatively if we want to move together as women, Black and white. Until now, white feminists have been reluctant to appreciate the differences, and therefore we have moved separately. And I don't know, I found this very good quote, and maybe we can start with you from the Right to the City working group, because now you brought this also up, Adelaide, and you are working really, I think, what I understand, with people who are very different, like bringing them together, and how you deal with difference creatively, like in the sense of how Audre Lorde put it.
Laura, would you like to answer this one? Because I just
Sure. Oh, sure. But you can add to whatever I've been missing. I think maybe I can talk a little bit what I've been thinking about when listening to the presentation, and then take it back to the discussions that we've been having in the Right to the City group, or let's say not the discussions, but the sort of debates and problems that we've had. So I like this idea that that solidarity is an expression of shared interest, and that it is always involving practices of solidarity that are sort of a mutual becoming, I think you said, right, Jeremy? And that they have this potentiality of transforming relations, identity, and to overcome these sort of identical or like identity issues. But at the same time, oftentimes it's a precondition and a reality to become involved in collective actions of solidarity, that we really have this critical inspection of into ourselves, into who we are, and into that, for example, also of what it means to be a man, what it means to be a woman, what it means to be an immigrant, and what it means to be a white man, and what it means to have privileges as and what it means to enjoy the privileges of white supremacy, of the institutions that we have, and the institutions and the housing market, how we fare better, and to recognize the fact that we have this shared interest. Like, it doesn't come as something natural or given just like this, that we have this shared interest. That's the point that I'm really trying to make, and that it involves specific investment, struggle, and conflict, positive conflict, and productive conflict over the shared interest, because not everyone sees the shared interest in the same way, and I think there's a lot of organizing and work and willingness to engage with these problems beforehand, and to listen to each other. And it's not something easily given. I mean, it's really like everyone know. I mean, lots of women know that being involved in political initiatives, that it's hard, and you're struggling constantly against men who'd like to talk over you, who'd like to dominate spaces. So it's understandable that a lot of women prefer to go in these sorts of safe spaces, or in spaces where they explicitly say it's not for men, because it's really hard work and it's constant struggle. And the privileges that men are invested in are not given up very easily. So it involves privileges. It's not just that. I simply don't believe that men that it's not in all men's interest to actually support feminist struggles. It's also not necessarily in everyone's interest to support housing struggles, as a lot of people have very, very vested interests to keep these privileges and powers. And that's something that we struggle over in the Right to the City AG or inside the campaign a lot, I would say. Maybe you want to add more to this, Adelaide, that it's really much more complicated than just shared interests, and it involves a lot of organizing, struggle, conflict, willingness to have dialogue, and willingness to actually engage in that dialogue and conversation, to at all understand that we have a shared interest that we can organize around.
So you're kind of working out that shared interest in a collective process.
Working out? I didn't understand exactly working out. Sorry.
No, I mean, as you said, like about when you're talking about the willingness to have dialogue and like the share, like I just thought like this is kind of working out together what the shared interest is actually, like in a group.
Got it. Thank you. I was lost in translation.
Sorry. I don't know, Matt, because you also mentioned in your brief intro about the notes here, the community land trusts work across race and class differences, and that you had some experience with this. So maybe you could also have an opinion.
Yeah, I mean, it's been the community land trust movement as it's sort of started to emerge in Liverpool. It's been quite it's been hard work. Yeah, the people involved most directly, and I'm not the most directly involved as, by any means. I'm much more of an observer who's happened to spend a couple of years with them, these different groups, and watching and trying to engage as much as I can. But it has been exactly as you said, Laura. This sort of very sort of agonistic negotiation, really quite trying times, trying to understand different people's perspectives, putting yourself in different people's shoes. And obviously I'm speaking as a white man here, so that throws open all sorts of different kind of aspects around power. But the CLTs themselves have been largely led by white women, middle class women, who've kind of stayed in this area and ironically enough only managed to struggle through to the bitter end against state compulsory purchase orders, because they had the right to buy given to them by Thatcher in the 1980s. So they've owned their own homes, but largely the community itself has been pushed out, completely sort of decanted from that area, and this is the black community really that have been displaced like this. So there's a lot of speaking for people in the community land trust movement, I guess, in Liverpool. Different groups speak for others. And there's a lot of work going at the moment to try and repair that difference and that divide across those differences. Not just inviting people in and opening membership up beyond the boundaries of those of that area that people have been displaced from, but beyond that, trying to think through really quite tough issues around governance and how conversations can actually happen. Is it in this community centre? Is it in that community centre? But beyond those kind of mundane issues, is it a sociocratic way of organising? Are we going to talk? Is it a consensus-based approach we're going to use to decision making? And we have a chair. We still use old-fashioned ways of doing this. Like there is a chair, but there's a tripartite governance structure which allows for not just residents and members, but other stakeholders, if you like, or other interested parties from the community who perhaps have been moved away, as well as experts, perhaps like myself, if I'm an expert, academically, or people involved in like the local state and finance who could offer advice. So the bringing together of all these different interests around a shared material space has been kind of incredibly generative, but also very conflictual. And I've witnessed meetings where someone stands up and shouts, "Who the fuck are you representing me? Who do you think you are?" And it's been a long shift of subjectivities, I guess. But that's the beauty of it. It really has been about cultivating new subjectivities on all different sides of these different power positions, I guess. Class, gender, race. But I think the last thing I wanted to add really was this idea of, because I see these, and I think the people involved as well see this too. They see the things they're doing in community land trust organising as articulating a commons in some way. So the CLT model itself isn't the be and end all. It's just a legal articulation of something much more principled and value driven, which is the idea of governing a commons through acts of commoning. And that process itself is very much about translation. I think it's about translating between different these different groups involved in the process, but also translating to wider audiences. So there's this guy called Dugald Hine who's written something quite, I think, absolutely incredible in terms of the way it captures this sort of idea. He says that there's this constant negotiation and conflict between the inward, the outward, and the upward language. So the inward language is that language that we develop as a kind of community of solidarity, I guess, around campaign. And it's quite arcane in many respects, and we'd all recognise this. It has its own kind of tropes and ways of speaking. And the outward language is that's sort of communicated to the public and try and get basically like support and solidarity across that divide of knowledge, and also the lack of experience that the public might have in the same struggle. And then the upward language is that we try to sort of put to the funders, the gatekeepers, the policymakers, and we have to speak in those terms, the legalistic terms, which is quite technical. And I think from the activists that I've spoken with and watched and been involved and engaged with over these last few years, they have really it's been a real struggle to try and shift gear between those three languages all the time. Just to sort of not only within the inward language, but also between the upward and the outward. But anyway, I don't know if that resonates with anything that you guys have experienced at all in the things you're doing.
Don't know if you want to respond directly to this.
Well, I don't think it's not for me to respond, really, is it?
Well, you can also. I think we can all talk. Like, we can take it easy. Like, and we can also. We should all be speaking. Let's just have a conversation together.
Well, I think what everybody said is really interesting. I mean, I'd sort of like to hear. I mean, we've gone down a route of talking about what makes struggle difficult, basically, which isn't news, to be honest. Like, the struggle is difficult. I guess I'd be interested to hear from other people on the panel. Like, what are the conditions for success? When struggle is effective, like when difficulties are overcome, and when something is actually achieved, like what are the commonalities in your experience between the different situations in which successes are achieved?
Can I comment real quick on that about achievement? I think already along the fact that we made it to create this working group was an achievement within an achievement, considering that the Deutsche Wohnen campaign is an achievement of the activists that organized it for the last couple of years. And but we have to remember that this campaign grew big and grew fond in the political scene or leftist scene in the city, started being spoken about, but still didn't address until recently the fact that more or less 25% of the people who live in Berlin don't have a German passport and therefore cannot sign the referendum or vote. And it took then the effort of people who are not necessarily migrants. Actually, I was the only migrant in the AG Stadthilfe, as far as I remember. But the people who were worried about it were not migrants, were people who were worried about the very material problem of like, okay, we need to win this, but 1/4 of the population of the city cannot participate, but they are also affected by housing issues. So this already is a nice symptom, in my opinion, like people who are not directly affected by this double problem. Everybody's affected by housing, but the double problem of being a person of color or without an European passport to find a flat is even worse. And the people who started to create this working group was not affected by that second part of the problem. So there's the shared interest that you mentioned, and I see the potentiality. But then, dialoguing with Matt said, to be able to convince other people that this is important, it has to be done, it requires another type of language again. And then to convince people outside the campaign, I mean, just regular Berliners, that this is important is another type of language. So I see that there are different steps of achievements, and already the creation of the working group for non-German tenants or non-German Berliners shows already a small victory, I would say, because of course, when we started bringing this idea of this working group, a lot of people were righteous I don't know how to say, righteously worried about time. Do we have time to create this? Do we have time to think about it? Do we have the resources? Is it going to be distracting for our final goal of collecting 200,000 signatures? Those are also legitimate worries. So, in the end, I think the shared interest has also a lot to do with the commitment of talking to each other, of this pedagogy or this commitment of acknowledging differences also. And I'm kind of repeating myself, but I remember when I was in Brazil in 2016 and I participated in the occupation of the universities because of the coup that happened there. It was very beautiful to see how was taken seriously the fact that Black women were disenfranchised from political activity, and through the fact was a commitment to make them like in the forefront of the movement. And the fact that we're fighting against this proto-fascism that we saw arise in Brazil was not scary anymore, because the solidarity was built in this small world already. So yeah, I would say that it's a lot of trust, but it has to have a commitment of understanding differences as something that are very real, even though they are pain in the ass. Sorry for my monologue. I think I spoke for 22 minutes.
I would also add to Adelaide that it's not necessarily, it's difficult to have these dialogues and these conflicts, but they're very important and productive. I think that it's not necessarily not an achievement. I think it's very much an achievement to have these conflicts, dialogues, and misunderstanding, but there has to be a willingness to be in dialogue about these things. So I'm not really an advocate of going separately necessarily, of separating these struggles, but in fact, I think these productive conflicts are very important, and they move every time the discussions, they move every time our understandings, and it's just that they really are time consuming. They consume our resources, and they really are, as Adelaide said, they're a pain in the ass, and it shouldn't be. They need to be acknowledged, because it's a lot of care work. It's a lot of conflict, willingness to be in conflict with each other, a willingness to listen, and that can be really frustrating to a lot of people and put them off. And that's obviously not a surprise, because there's a lot of things to be lost for people who are in these groups and have a vested interest and privileges in there, and it's really important to struggle over it. So I think it's an achievement. So it's positive, I would say.
So maybe there's something to be added to the theory, like the productive conflict, because I feel like I don't know, we are so kind of used to kind of everything has to function seamlessly, and this is kind of what we grow up with learning. But this is actually important, like to have those conflicts and this kind of take also the time to have them. I feel this could be an addition that comes out from the discussion. Maybe we could also talk a bit more on the. I think it was interesting, Matt, you brought in the point of language. And you also mentioned this, like, how do we talk about those things, and how do we talk about those shared interests? Because when we were talking about, also like the patriarchy also sucks for men, I think this is true, but I don't think everybody has like, how do we make people understand that this is, we are thinking about kind of a different vision, like an actually potentially different future that we could kind of build together. And I mean, this is now a big question, but we can also break it down to the housing topics that you were working on. How do we actually speak about those things, and maybe create also more this kind of a language of solidarity that we use when speaking to the public? Because I feel like often the thinking is very much into, what is your individual interest? This is what we grow up, learning. And how can we, I was thinking about this just as a point. A week ago or so, they started this campaign here in Germany, the Zero COVID. And this kind of caught my attention, because I felt they were using a language that was putting solidarity in the front, like saying that something like, if there are people who cannot protect themselves from the virus, then, we cannot have the virus, then we cannot live with it, because there are people who have to take the bus. There are people who have to go to work. There are people who cannot protect themselves. So we can't, as a society, we can't, we don't want to live in a society where this happens. And I found this remarkable in a way that oftentimes things are not put this way. Yeah. I don't know, what do you think about kind of the language of solidarity and kind of formulating a vision for a shared interest?
Well, I could only really talk about the Anglo-American context, but I guess I would say in that certainly in the British context, I would say that it's a very simple answer, really. It's a very simple situation that the sort of political left, and this was certainly the case during the period of Corbyn's leadership of the Labour Party, is very, very bad at speaking a language of solidarity which is not moralistic. So essentially, Corbyn's discourse, even when he was talking about issues which really had a very direct material consequences for most people in the country. Housing is the example I always give, actually. That when he was asked to speak about the housing question, Corbyn's response would always be to evoke the figure of the homeless and say, this is terrible. Look, the homeless are it's terrible. It's a moral outrage that there are homeless people, and we should all be outraged by this, and we should all care about it. And that was the kind of version of solidarity. And he would never refer to the fact that actually this is an issue that most people have a stake in. Like, most people have a stake in a functioning housing system, that it affects everybody. Like it isn't, and it affects people directly and in a way that isn't just understandable on a sort of moral axis. So the idea, and to some extent, I think this is specific probably to the English context, not even Britain. It's probably specific to the English context. It's partly because a liberal frame of reference is so kind of pernicious and so sort of hegemonic that I think people find it it's very difficult for people to think in solidaristic terms, and other than in terms of a kind of sense of moral duty, something they should do because it's good, because it's morally correct, and it has this sort of Christian legacy. And I think that is a real it's a real sort of weakness. But I think it's also it's important. I don't know what relevance. I can't really speak to what relevance that has to other contexts, to be honest. But certainly here, the question of on that concrete question of housing, in particular, it's a real sort of, it's a very interesting situation that it's a key issue. And it's an issue which there is all kinds of scope for promoting a sort of solidaristic politics, and it's an area of public policy which has been deliberately developed, deliberately anti-solidaristic politics and policies have been promoted for several decades, and a very deliberate attempt to kind of make it difficult for people to imagine themselves in solidaristic social relations with each other. But for me, that's an example. As an example, at least in the particular context that I know, I think appeals to sort of morality are often kind of habitual, but they're really unhelpful in terms of actually mobilizing people. And they're just unnecessary. It's not that people should never care about other people, care about the weak. I just think there's always some horizon within which it's possible to evoke a shared future within which it would be, in the interests of whatever group of people you're trying to bring together, to cooperate in, I think. And sometimes that's difficult. Now you get into a slightly different question, which is the question of how you sort of conceptualize interests, which is a whole other issue, really. But I think, it's always important to say, groups of, people always have, any one person can have complex and sort of multiple sets of interests. And in the case of groups who enjoy certain kinds of privilege, they can have a short-term interest in defending those privileges. If it's specific, particularly if they think that the only likely political outcomes in the foreseeable future will be, varying shades of bad. If they think that, essentially there's no real prospect of building some better kind of social set of institutions or some better set of shared futures that can include a lot of people without costing them a lot, then people will be defensive. But at some level, at some possible imaginative horizon, and I think it's always in people's there's always a level at which shared interests can be shared interests can be articulated in a way that would, to some extent, benefit everybody if they were realised. But I mean, this gets very abstract. I mean, I would say certainly. I'm just going to repeat myself if I keep talking. I'm going to stop talking.
Does any of the Matt, please?
Yeah, I mean, maybe just following on from that a little bit around language and how we see these things now. I think there's been I've been reading recently this stuff around solidarism, like this French movement in the late 19th century called solidarism. I think this is kind of roughly where the solidarity sort of comes from, I guess, in a way, in terms of the way we see it today, out of the French Revolution and into this strange kind of sort of, I guess, kind of like a third way to liberalism and socialism in the late 19th century in France. And the way these solidarists framed it was around a kind of like a debt of an obligation to pay your debt to society. So, working off of Durkheim's idea around organic solidarity, that we're all interconnected through the division of labour, and that therefore, we produce so much more and we get so much more through that kind of collaboration, cooperation and interconnectedness. And without each other, we just couldn't survive. And they used this metaphor at the time. I can't remember who it was exactly, a French solidarist who talked about this being like two mountain climbers connected to each other by a rope. And, they could, by understanding each other's connection in that terms, they could climb higher. And also, they also reduce their risk of falling to their death. And this is what I found fascinating about this movement, which has been largely forgotten and almost, I guess, written over by neoliberalism and by liberalism. That it's quite a specific legal understanding of debt. Solidarity is about debt, the debt that we owe to society for basically raising us collectively, giving us the skills and the education and so on to be part of this thing and contribute something back. And I think maybe that's what we need to start thinking about. And of course, there is a danger here that we end up going into morality, as Jeremy has said. If we start thinking of rephrasing debt, why is it the case that we have to pay our debts to these rentiers, these landlords, both in money terms and land terms, who basically sit on this stuff, having not earned it, and yet they charge interest? How is that a debt? That's not really the debt that we really should be honouring. We should be honouring a different kind of debt, a debt to each other, and the fact that we've cultivated each other collectively. And I guess, like I say, that does go into that kind of tricky territory around unearned profits versus earned profits, and it starts to sort of you start to sort of it's not the most sort of structuralist way of thinking about it, and it can lead to some problematic tendencies, I guess, in thinking about socialism. But I think reconceiving what we think of as debt is a way forward for conceiving of solidarity in linguistic and discursive terms, I guess.
I'm against debts, Matt. Abolish the debts. Don't do this to us.
Yeah, I would say too. I would wonder, if you consider solidarity as sort of a debt that you have to someone else or to society, doesn't that sort of bring in the notion just on the very basis that as soon as you do something for someone, you're expected to give something back, but that's not possible for everyone. And you're not acting in solidarity fundamentally because you expect someone else to do something back to you. I mean, there's got to be a dimension of freedom to be and to act in solidarity with other people. You cannot force anyone to be in solidarity because we all have so different resources and come from so different conditions, from so different lives. I mean, that would be like coming from an ideal situation, which we're definitely not, because we are in this society, and capitalism has it that we occupy so many different positions, and that we are, that we have so fundamentally different resources. So I think thinking about it in debt it is maybe not so productive, because it makes that more, like you were saying, maybe this moral imperative. I'd like to think more in terms of the feminist idea that my capabilities of being in this world is so dependent on other people from the very fact that I'm born by someone else, I'm raised by someone else, I'm cared for by someone else. So I can only really care for someone if someone else cares for me. So my identity or my being in the world is fundamentally dependent on another person. So I might not need so much help from someone right now, but I might need that later on, or I might need that from a friend, but at some point. But I'm fundamentally interconnected with my neighbor. My life wouldn't be the same if my neighbor wouldn't be there. My life wouldn't be the same if the shop across the street wouldn't be there. My life wouldn't be there if I didn't have my friends. So I think that sort of interdependency of understanding and recognizing our interdependent fates is really important, and therefore we are interconnected, and that's what we need to honor. Maybe I don't know if that is too moralistic, but
no, I think I would also more resonate with what you just said. I feel that also like the concept of debt is very negative. Like I feel like we're not motivated as humans by something that is kind of like a duty, like we have to, but I feel like we need more like a vision that we can look forward to rather than something we have to pay back. Just as a so Jeremy, you have to put your mic on.
Can you hear me?
No? Yeah, now yes, yeah.
All right, sorry, the mic was on, I thought. I mean, there's this very interesting idea in the French philosopher Emmanuel Levinas, and then Derrida, he was very influenced by him, of the infinite debt, the debt which can never be, which is incalculable and can never be paid, and which I have similar aversion to for the same reasons, but it's a way of trying to evoke that notion of interdependence. I mean, actually, Derrida always evokes it when he talks about a kind of politics of immigration. I mean, I always find, trying to explain to students why I support a kind of ethically support a no borders position. Like it's always an interesting reference point that, there is no lip. And in fact, I've tried to theorize it myself in ways that I tried to bring all these things together. I had this concept, this term, what I call infinite relationality. The relationality, that the nature of our interdependence is incalculable. Like firstly, interdependence isn't a moral injunction; it's just a fact. And I would say, to some extent, I would say this is the basic claim of the left. Actually, always that we are interdependent. Doesn't matter if you don't want to be; you are. I always say I always say, if I'm trying to sort of give a basic critique of individualist thinking to students, I always say, look, nobody comes into the world alone. There's always at least one other person there. You can't escape that. That's not, that is a sort of, and that interdependence is just a reality. The way I conceptualize this really is liberalism wants to deny that. Wants to say, no, it's not true. It's not true that interdependence is a basic fact of social existence. It's something you enter into voluntarily. You join you form a contract. There's something, you enter into a social contract, but fundamentally you're an individual. And conservatism always wants to say, yes, it recognizes our interdependence, but therefore interdependence has to be contained by these units, the family, the nation, the country. It has to be contained by relations of authority and by borders, which make it sort of controllable and determinable. And the sort of democratic sort of tradition and the radical tradition, as I understand it, to some extent, it is always based on recognizing that interdependence is inescapable, but it's also infinite. You can't calculate it, you can't know it, you can't predict all its effects, which is partly why. I think the notion of debt I also share this initial aversion to this notion of debt, but then some thinkers think it's an interesting idea. But I think everybody is trying to get at the same idea, whether you're kind of whether you like the term debt or you don't like the term debt. Everybody is sort of trying to get at the same idea, that there's no limit, there's no way you can't quantify the extent to which you need other people, and that they make you what you are, and you make them what they are, and that the only functional politics, like for the environment, for people, for human beings, for the whole world, the only functional politics is one which accepts that as just a basic fact. whether you like it or not, it's a basic fact that we are interdependent to an extent that we can't calculate, we can't enumerate, we can't evaluate, and that has to be the basis for. That is the basis for me of the kind of a sort of. And to me, a notion of solidarity is one way of sort of expressing that. It's one way of expressing that sort of the basic idea, I think.
Mm-hmm. We are coming towards the last, I would say, 10 minutes of the conversation. We have now spent a long time on this topic. I would maybe, in closing, pick up the thought that you said you also wanted to talk about this kind of building more enduring relations, more longer term. And this maybe at this point we can bring in also a question that came in from the audience. We have one question, Aldana, right, so far. Because this is about kind of organizational thing. What about returning to the commons as a way of finding some stability through owning and caring in place collectively? Mm-hmm. So as like bringing in the commons as an organizational principle.
I'm in favor.
Which could maybe be which maybe could lead to, because if we, and maybe this is also something where you could speak on, Matt, because you're kind of about organizational and institutional kind of frameworks for solidarity, which I think are important if we're thinking about the longer term. Sorry, Jeremy.
No, I was just joking. I just said I'm in favor of it. I'm in favour of building the commons.
Shall I say a couple of things in about this? Yeah, I mean, I'm also in favour of building the commons. Who isn't? And this thing around sort of trying to build enduring structures, I guess the things that come up again and again and again in the work I'm doing is, particularly in the housing co-ops in the 70s, they went through this period where they would sort of gestate this kind of like this incredible thing, this campaign, and make it into something, make it into a housing co-op, an actual building, which this collective has sort of actually like designed themselves, and they almost built themselves. They've contracted people in quite extraordinary ways, and then they start governing it. And it's like people I speak to there talk about the post-development blues. They talk about the fact that they've sort of got this baby kicking and screaming and don't know what to do with it anymore. And then the depression sets in, where they have to deal with rent arrears and management issues, and actually do the hard work of governing as a group without that excitement, that initial excitement of doing the kind of campaigning and the struggle against the council for the land, etc. And it's interesting that this comes up again and again, and especially with generations, as the first generation start to sort of leave, what happens to their children or newcomers that come in. I mean, unfortunately, it was quite a traditional hereditary system back in the 70s in Liverpool in the co-ops, but as generations come and go, how do sort of activists sustain these things? And I guess I don't have any answers. I guess you guys probably have more than I do, really, in terms of thinking about alternatives and ways can be brought together. But for me, I think it's probably around basically trying to sustain that enjoyment and the joy, basically animated by that original sort of the passion for the collective passion for that project. And so I guess in the past, in the early 20th century, late 19th century, there were in northern Italy, for instance, there were like houses of the people and chambers of labour, which were basically kind of like the house of the people in a small Italian town or village, or city like Bologna, for instance, in northern Italy, would contain like a co-op, and it would contain mutual aid society, and you'd have bars and cafes and a theatre, for instance, and space for basically people to get drunk together and celebrate continually, but also space for education, political education, and continuing those kind of organising principles and embedding economic democracy in different parts of society from that base. And I think that's what we've lost, really. I think this exists in Berlin today in part, but does it exist in a way that crosses class and race differences? I don't know. But those sort of spaces of solidarity that we've lost, I think, since the rise of fascism and since the rise of neoliberalism, and we haven't got that back again. And a housing co-op, for me, is something that has the potential, or community land trust or similar, they have the potential to provide such a base but they need to be more than just housing. They need to be about the full range of human experience, right? And not just housing, also jobs, but not just jobs, also, pleasure and enjoyment and art. And I think that's really important, which we certainly don't have that at the moment in the UK, aside from a few spaces like the Mayday rooms, maybe, but that's again quite limited. I don't know. I'll leave it at that.
I would agree that, like creating a common, or what we are striving for example, which would be a common very much, to expropriate this housing stock of an estimated 240,000 flats and sort of like manage it collectively, is obviously the advantage is that there's that as soon as we have something so important to our lives, such as housing, which is really important for our material basis in general, so that we can, eat, cook, live, care for each other, and so on. It gives us more agency to be involved in political struggles, because we have one of the basic things secured for our lives, and for our well-being. That's really essential, I think. Helps us to go out and be happy, to be joyful, to be there for each other, to actually have these capabilities. And it gives us more autonomy and agency in life. But I think evidently a common is still surrounded by it's an island, and therefore there has to be still this willingness to stay in a struggle and to have an acute analysis of the political problems out there, and to keep on struggling, because a lot of commons, you probably know so much more about this, Matt, is that the problem is that a lot of community land trusts, as soon as people become invested in these spaces, they can easily become involved in a process again of commodifying these spaces, and then of excluding people again. So it's very, very important in a way to sort of revert back to what we said at the beginning, to cultivate that political analysis and that political debate culture that Adelaide and I, we think also is so crucial, that we have this critical engagement, but also fundamentally a critical analysis of what's going outside. So we revert our gaze out from the commons and see what we have to do to struggle and keep on, and also protect the commons, because the commons, it's super essential, and it gives us more autonomy and more space, more freedom in a way. But there's still the world out there, and it's pretty evil, and it's miserable, and it needs to be enlarged. No, I mean, what? Or Adelaide, I don't know. What would you say
about the evil world? No, I would just add a comment on the homeless workers movement in Brazil, which is the biggest urban movement in Latin America. When they occupy an area which is unbuilt or abandoned, the first thing that they built is a community kitchen, because they know that that's where the place of being together will then make the possibility that this occupation is long-living, even when the police come, even when bombs are thrown, even when eviction comes. So this is the first thing. But what is interesting to check, it's also a place that is very connected with caring, where women will be cooking, not alone, because there's a lot of politicization inside the landless workers movement, the homeless workers movement, about that. But still there is, just connecting with Matt said, still this is like, it's not just about housing, it's about this whole idea of being together to create humanized ways of living. And this is important, I think, to keep in mind of, then again, the joy that Jeremy mentioned, and the joy in which we are now trying to create this urban movement in Berlin that is about not only tackling the housing problem, housing issues, speculation, gentrification, but also city where it's possible to live. Because now what we see is that like gentrification and private investments somehow are responsible of taking care of the city in a cosmetic way. So the streets where you're going to have a lot of coffee shops, you're going to have lights, and therefore women and people of color are going to feel safe to walk those streets, because then the Nazis cannot punch so easily people of color because there's light, and you cannot be catcalled or harassed because there's light and there's movement. So the idea of this whole discussion on expropriation and around the referendum is also a city that it's better in all aspects possible. And community kitchens, always nice.
Thanks, Adelaide. I think these were good points on the kind of organizational structures side. We unfortunately have to close very soon. There is one question that came in from the chat, which is 100 years ago today, the Italian Communist Party was founded. This leads me to the question, how can we build solidarity in the complete absence of organized structures, such as the PCI, or even unions whose membership has become so low throughout the industrialized West? I feel you have already mentioned like your own structures or something, but yeah, just if you want to comment on this, maybe also for Jeremy.
Well, yeah, I think there's no substitute for trying to rebuild institutions of that nature. Although we still don't know what they're going to look like in the 21st century. I mean, that's it. It's a very abstract answer, but I think it's the only answer that can be given, really, is that I think it's quite clear just from the experience of the past 30 years that in the absence of those kinds of enduring institutions, like you get nowhere. You just get you get a new cohort of activists every 5 years, like constantly reinventing the wheel, like as Matt said earlier. And that's been, in countries or in areas of activism where there aren't enduring institutions, you already see that. Like in Britain, the environmental movement, for example, is completely notorious and for doing this, for not having any structures that can reproduce, that can transmit knowledge from one cohort to another, and just people constantly doing the same things and making the same mistakes and getting nowhere. So I think that's, but also clearly what I think, I don't really agree with people like Jody Dean, who just the Americans, a political theorist, which I understand where they're coming from, but their response, and people like Slavoj Žižek has kind of tried to popularize these views. They've looked at the history of the past 200 years and they've said the only thing that ever worked was the Revolutionary Party, the Democratic Centralist Revolutionary Party. So we're going to do that. We just have to do that. I mean, my position is, my position on that is, you could join a Democratic Centralist Revolutionary Party at any point in the past 50 years if you wanted to. It wouldn't have got you very far. It's not like they haven't existed. Like there's some reason why they haven't worked. And I don't know what they are. I mean, I guess I sort of feel like my sense is that, I mean, this seems like really an obvious thing to say now, but the fact that it seems really obvious and quite banal is to some extent a political advance on where we were 20 years ago. I would say I mean, if I think back 20 years ago, I think this was the case in the sort of Anglosphere, but it was also the case with everybody I knew in Berlin anyway. The kind of the disillusionment with the sort of party structures and a certain naivety about the potential of sort of the internet and forms of spontaneous horizontal organizing meant that, I mean, there were a lot of people running around who thought you could just do without, you didn't need anything. You didn't need institutions and organizations that would carry out the historic functions of the party. I don't think anybody does think that now, to be honest. I mean, not many people anyway. So it's become sort of a truism that we're all in our different movement and activist and organizing contexts. We're all looking for ways to build institutions, and it may well take a really long time to figure out how to do it. I mean, the PCI didn't just come out of nowhere. The PCI was like the culmination of 200 years almost of people figuring out how to do political democracy in an industrial society. And now we're in a different kind of society, and our enemies have all kinds of tools at their disposal that they didn't used to have, and so do we. And we don't know. I have no idea how long it's going to take before we can build those kinds of institutions. But I think it is at least an advance on where we were 20 years ago, that I think everybody recognises we need to build them, which is something.
All right, I think we have to come to a wrap up. We're already kind of over time. I don't know, like I would like to just do a kind of closing round. If you want to have like a last, just like one sentence or two sentences to close off. We ran through different topics, kind of. So it's maybe hard to kind of have a closing statement. But like, what kind of remains for you from the conversation? What you still want to share with the audience? Maybe we start with Adelaide. Sorry.
Caught by surprise. What I get from the conversation is that conversations are always great, and I took so many notes, which is already super nice to do research later. And what I would like to say is that if you are watching us, you are in Berlin, we need actives. We are starting the collection of signatures by the end of February. We have working groups in every kids of the city. So write us. We are on Instagram at DW and Eignen. I'm sorry, it's German.
I think we put the links also everywhere, like in the chat. Nice. And then in the Telegram, yeah, so people can find it.
Nice, thank you everybody. It was super fruitful.
Thank you. I don't know, Matt, you want to go next? So.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, thanks everyone. It was I really enjoyed it. When I got the message yesterday afternoon, it was quite a sudden kind of moment of, oh, am I going to do this? Yeah, but it was wonderful to be part of the conversation. And for me, I don't know. I mean, I guess I think that idea of radical interdependence and that the fact that it's infinite interdependence as a fact of reality is fascinating. And I think we do need to be better at framing. I guess for me, it's like how do we as the left, how do we frame that? How do we like present it? And as we discussed, debt is very lacking as a concept. The gift, I mean, that doesn't quite do it either. But solidarity is obviously it, isn't it? But I guess it's for me, I'm going to take away a lot about how do we go around working up better ways of describing this stuff. Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Jeremy?
I'd just like to thank everyone for taking part. It was a really rich discussion and I learned a lot, and thank you. It's very helpful. And I'd encourage everybody to support your campaigns to take back the city, wherever you are.
And Laura? Thank you so much. I did learn a lot too. I can only add to Adelaide and say, even if you're just in quotation mark an English speaker or feel your best expressed in English, please come and join us. Yeah. And I think I'm sort of thinking more about this question of creating enduring relations building or enduring institutions. I would probably think more about creating these enduring relations more than the institutions, because the institutions can always disappear, and they have, but the relationships and the sort of recognition maybe of our interdependencies never does. And as soon as that is recognized, we can always struggle for the next space and the next encounter, hopefully. Maybe that's what I would like to add last.
Okay. Well, thank you all very much. That was it. So the stream can go offline. Thank you.
Bye.